you looking for a different level of truth about your challenges and struggles? Then be a part of the Yes and podcast, hosted by empowerment strategist and trauma specialist Jennifer Whitacre. Every Wednesday, we challenge conventional thinking on topics like trauma, healing, and so much more. Learn life lessons and great nuggets of wisdom from guests who've moved through their pain and suffering to discover a new purpose in life. Now, here's your host, Jennifer Whitacre.
Hi, everyone. This is Jennifer Whitacre, and you're watching or listening to another episode of Yes and. And it's a pleasure to have you back listening to the show again this week. And if you like the episodes that you've heard in the past, please subscribe, please share, let your friends know. I really try to bring value and information that can help you sort through whatever it is you're dealing with. And this week, we're going to talk about how do you know if you should look for a therapist or find a coach? Because there's a lot of overlap in the two professions, and it can be really confusing. And there's also a lot of distinct differences in the two professions. So today on the show, we have Dr. Toni Warner. And Dr. Toni Warner she's a mother of three. She's a transformational life and wellness coach for busy, ambitious people who are ready to crush, overwhelm, tame the anxiety, effectively manage stress, and delete burnout. She helps her clients create meaningful balance in their lives while boosting motivation and energy levels without sacrificing productivity at work or quality time with loved ones. That's really important, is to have balance in our lives. Dr. Toni is the founder of Dr. Toni Coaches, and she is also the founder of Authentically Me Psychotherapy, which are two different businesses, separate services, and she even, puts in her emails, if you're not sure which service is the best fit for your needs, reach out and ask. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to do that reach out and ask on the podcast. So Dr. Toni, it's an honor to have you with us today. I'm so thrilled that you're here, and welcome to the show. And I'd like to hear what you have to say about yourself in your own words.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. I appreciate you inviting me and just allowing me to connect with you and everyone else that's listening. So I take this as a privilege, and I'm glad to be here. So building off of what you shared, I am a mom of three. I have, at this time, an almost 3-year-old, which is crazy. I can't believe he's going to be 3. This weekend he's going to be 3.
Goes fast, doesn't it?
Oh my gosh. And then my middle one is 7, just turned 7 a little bit ago. And then I have my 10-year-old going on 21, but she'll be 11 soon. Mm-hmm. And she's very much like her mama. So blessing and challenges incorporated there, right?
Yeah.
And I love being a mom. I've always wanted to be a mom and a therapist of some sort. And so coaching kind of found me along the way. And so I am also a licensed clinician, which is what Authentically Me Psychotherapy is. I've worked in a variety of settings, providing clinical services, counseling, consulting, and things like that in school settings, psychiatric hospitals, in the community setting as well, doing family work with kids, teens. But my private practice now really focuses on adults as well as teens that are feeling a lot of stress, navigating all the stressors of life and wanting to do well, but really having a hard time functioning in a way that works for them, and really having a hard time feeling happy with the life that they're trying to live, even though they're working really hard at it. And so as I was building up my private practice, coaching kind of found me, and that led me to a place where I learned actually I can have an even bigger impact outside of my office as well. So I still maintain my private practice, and I absolutely love my clients, and I love doing therapy. But I found a passion and a love for coaching that was unexpected along my journey. And there I really get to help the ambitious leaders, the busy professionals that have a lot going on and have kind of neglected some of that balance with the personal and professional lives. And so they're wanting to either up-level that or to create that because they haven't had that in their lives. And that is kind of how you and I met as well. Yes. So I'm excited to dive in and see how I can support with clarifying some of the differences and making that determination between which might be the best fit for someone.
Yeah. So how, what are some of the reasons that somebody might want to seek out coaching instead of psychotherapy?
So I'm going to preface this with the fact that I think it's helpful to get an individualized consultation with whomever it is that you're interested in potentially working with, because there are a lot of nuances. So I will be speaking in generalities here, and hunkering down where I can. However, even with me as a therapist, my style is different than the therapist next to me. Mm-hmm. And so where there may be differences for what I provide as a therapist versus a coach, that may not be the same for someone else who's also doing therapy and coaching. And so it's nuanced, as you said. Mm-hmm. It's not super boxy, but there are some distinct differences also, which is what you mentioned. And one of those really is that therapy is a medical model. Mm-hmm. And so therapy, it was birthed out of a medical model where there is a diagnosis, which means insurance can be billed for that, and it is prescribed as treatment. And so what's being provided is a course of treatment depending on the symptoms that are being presented. And a diagnosis is going to be kind of labeled, is going to be provided based on the symptoms that are being presented, and treatment is to follow suit. And that's why the labels kind of create these boxes, which some people find comfort in, and some people find really constraining. And there are a bunch of people in between that have a mixture of both. Like, oh, it's comforting to know that other people have ADHD. It's comforting to know that these symptoms are like, oh, I have ADHD, and other people have that. And so there's some connection there, but also there can be some boxes that people put themselves in. We're like, oh no, I have ADHD, whatever that might be. So there's pros and cons, right, to having that label. I'm not a therapist that treats specifically based on the diagnosis. I am a therapist that treats based on the symptoms that I'm seeing, based on the strengths and needs of that particular individual, as well as the strengths and needs that I bring to the table as a therapist based on my experience, my expertise, my areas of specialized training. Mm-hmm. So there are.
Can I ask a quick question?
Absolutely, please.
That makes a lot of sense. And, you mentioned that, as a therapist that, a lot of times you work with the diagnosis and, mm-hmm. You mentioned, like the codes and insurance. So you're more likely to have that label and refer to the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. That's come up on the show in the past, but I always like to point it out in case, we have new listeners that don't know what that is. And it seems to me that people seem to have a misunderstanding of the diagnosis a lot of times, where they'll get the label and people will say, oh, well, that explains it. I have, ADHD. And I think that we get that backwards, because ADHD is nothing more than a label for a cluster of symptoms. It doesn't explain anything other than naming your symptoms. It doesn't explain how did you get it, where did it come from, where did it originate, where are the roots. And so I see that as a huge drawback with the DSM and mental illness. I think whenever it comes to other types of illness, that the DSM might not be as confusing.
So yes, and the purpose of the DSM initially really was to create a means of communicating clearly amongst professionals. Mm-hmm. And so if one part of a medical team is treating someone and then someone else is treating that same person for something else, the label per se is kind of a language amongst professionals to say, this is the general symptoms that we're managing, that we're working with. And so it was kind of an easier way, a more succinct and concise way to communicate from professional to professional as they're supporting someone. It's evolved since then. And I think that's some of the challenges that you're seeing.
Yeah. And I'm curious. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I would say I agree that's not uncommon. That challenge is not uncommon. I definitely can hear that challenge there for sure.
I'm curious, as a psychotherapist, which I am not, if you find it somewhat limiting in what you can do with your clients.
So I actually don't accept insurance in my private practice, and I don't focus on labels. So I don't find it limiting.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes.
And I'll share with clients too, if this is the diagnosis that these symptoms fall under, we can have a conversation about that. However, I'm not treating this particular diagnosis. I'm treating the symptoms we're seeing based on the strengths and needs that you and I have in therapy. It typically isn't viewed as a team or a partnership. It's typically viewed as, I'm the clinical expert, but I view the client as the expert of their life. And then together we're working jointly and cohesively to support that person. Whereas in coaching, it's tended to be seen more as a partnership, as a team. So there's a little bit of a difference there. I think it's intricate and nuanced too, though, because I do not see myself as a clinician as the expert of their life. I'm not the only expert in the room, right? And even so, expert is such a strong word. I don't know everything about everything. I'm a human that's learning and growing. Right. I always engage in continuing education. Our field is constantly evolving, bringing in new information, bringing in new research to learn, right? We're always learning and growing.
And everything you just described is the hallmark of an expert. It is a myth that the expert knows everything. And that's why people who, say, well, you're the expert. Well, yeah, that's a ridiculous thing to say to somebody, because a true expert approaches any given situation with curiosity and like a beginner. They don't go in with this big ego going, oh, I know what to do before I walk in the room.
Well, and that creates that imposter syndrome, right? Like, yes. I'm an expert, so I'm supposed to know everything. And that's going to take us on a whole other tangent. Right. But it's true. It's true. I'm supposed to know everything. And since I don't know everything, how can I be an expert, or how can I be of help? And that's just not true. We always have more to learn. We always have more ways we can grow in.
Yeah, it's another myth that we collectively bought into. Yeah. And so you mentioned that as a clinician, you do not take insurance. So I think that's another important point that a person wants to think about when they're choosing a therapist, if they're choosing the therapy route. Do you want to find a therapist who accepts insurance or not? And why, aside from the financial aspects, because it's so much more than just money. Usually money is the client's reason for, finding a therapist with insurance who takes insurance. But I think there's so much more in the quality of service that you receive. So could you talk to that a little bit about why would you choose one therapist over the other, like insurance versus not?
So this is a contentious point in the field of psychotherapy, so I will delicately traverse here. There are those who feel very strong.
Psychotherapists, so we're good.
there are those who feel very strongly about needing to accept insurance, and there are those who feel very strongly about not needing to. I would say I'm in the middle. And reasons being is that when you accept insurance, yes, it is cheaper generally speaking, it's cheaper for the client, and therefore it is more accessible. And that means that regardless of socioeconomic status, everyone has access to a therapist if they want it. I don't think that's completely true, because not everyone has insurance, first and foremost. But also having access to a therapist is different than having access to the therapist that's going to be best suited to you and your needs. Yeah. And that's besides insurance. And I will say I had intended to take insurance, and I had personally a really hard time making the decision not to take insurance. And since then, I'm really glad that I decided not to at this point in time in my life. And I reserve the right to grow. If I change my mind in the future, I change my mind in the future. But for right now, the clients that come to me, they are coming to me because they want to work with me. They can see what I'm specializing in. They can feel the energy and vibration that I provide based on what they're reading about me and the consultation that I provide. And so they want to work with me. They're not just looking for a therapist. Once we connect, they're like, no, you are my therapist. And that's why they go that way. And so although they may first be wondering about the financial piece, ultimately they're making the decision based on the connection they think is going to best serve them. And my clients tend to stay once they come in. And so it really does depend on you and what you're looking for. If the primary barrier is finances, then of course use your insurance. There's some amazing therapists that do accept insurance or provide sliding scales. I do have sliding scale slots. And so you can go either way, but really what I would say is whichever route you go, whether you're going through insurance or you're not, make sure that you talk with the therapist. Try to get a consultation first, like a free consult if you can first, and that it's a good fit for you. That's what makes the most transformational coaching or therapy is the fit, the goodness of fit between the people. That's the most powerful, most important thing. And if you're feeling forced into working with a therapist because of finances that you don't actually get along with, it can create more frustration than it can reduce stress, which isn't what anyone wants.
Yeah. So I hope all of the listeners really heard what she just said right there. If you're working with a therapist and it's not a good therapist-client match, which I am guilty of in the past, and I can say from my life experience that yes, it did set me back, because I didn't speak up, I didn't say anything. And, especially like in my 20s, whenever, I would just pick a therapist and go start seeing a therapist and didn't give enough thought to this and didn't even know that this was a conversation I should have with myself. So I think these are some really, really important points, to think about whenever we're choosing a therapist. And yeah. And I also love the idea of seeing if you can get a free consultation if money is an issue, because a lot of therapists will offer that. A lot of coaches will offer that.
Absolutely.
And it's so worth it. And even if there is a fee, a lot of times there's a minimal fee. And I've also seen therapists or coaches who will charge a fee for the consultation. And then if you sign up for sessions, then you get your money back from the consultation. Which is kind of a give and take, because they'll, like reduce your first session or what have you. So there are a lot of different ways to look at this, and it's so important to shop around, because when people endure trauma that gets imprinted in the nervous system, it happens in relationship. Very rarely are we just by ourselves when trauma happens. There are usually other people around. So healing happens in relationship too, which is why that therapist-client connection is so stinking important if you want to get better. And so I think these are really, really super important points to talk about. Thank you so much, Toni, for bringing this up. It's so important. Yeah. And so what else have we not talked about or covered yet on considerations when choosing a therapist?
A therapist specifically?
Mm-hmm.
I really think that's the most important part, is the goodness of fit. But I will say, I can relate. I also was in positions when I was younger where I just had to see a therapist and kind of just saw the therapist that was available to me. And I wouldn't say something negative came out of it, but it wasn't super helpful either. And so you get to, maybe you don't know everything there is about therapists. Most people don't, but you still get to express your thoughts and feelings. And if you're with a therapist and you're not sure about the fit, you're curious about it, saying that, don't worry about offending the therapist. I tell this to my clients. And again, this is coming from me, so I can't speak for all therapists, but I tell this to my clients. I say, if there's something that feels off, or I'm misunderstanding something, or there's some kind of miscommunication, if you feel there's some kind of verge that's coming up for you, let me know. Never worry about offending me, because I'm here to support you. And if offense were to come out of it that had nothing to do with me, but was coming from that person, then that's rich information right there for us to dive into about some ways where that may come up in other relationships. But regardless, if it's never brought up, it never gets tended to. Right. And so what might happen is, if you bring up, I'm feeling like maybe a mismatch, or I'm feeling like you're not challenging me, right? If you're not bringing it up, then they don't know. And then they can't respond, which means you won't really know. You won't get that answer. You won't really know if it's the fit or if maybe it's just there's something happening in your minds that needs to be discussed. And then you discuss it, right? And maybe if you had discussed it, who knows? And you discuss it, you're like, oh, like I actually feel a lot better now that I got to say that and I didn't feel like I had to hold it in.
Yeah. And that's a perfect example of what Brene Brown means when she talks about vulnerability. Just like speaking up and telling what you're experiencing or what's going through your mind at the time are those little moments of vulnerability that can really have a huge impact on your overall life.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you. Wow. Wonderful information. So what about coaching? How does coaching fit into this whole discussion? And, what are like similarities, differences? Why might we choose one over another?
Coaching tends to focus on the how, and therapy tends to focus on the why. Now, here I am speaking in generalities because, like I said, all therapists, our styles are a little bit different. But in therapy, we might be focusing more on the roots of what has led to some of these challenges that you're seeing happen in your life. Maybe they're relationship patterns that have been toxic or whatever the case may be. And so we might be focusing more on the root so that we can help make the shifts in the here and now that increase your quality of life. Whereas coaching, we might be focusing more on action steps that are going to help you move forward and kind of get out of that stuckness of those patterns that are being created. I personally marry both. I marry both the why and the how into therapy and coaching, but I'm definitely heavier on the why in therapy. Although I never dig into a why that's not impacting someone in the here and now.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Right? Because if it's not impacting you now, we don't need to go back and try to relive it, right? That's not the purpose. It's not to go back and dig things up. It's if something's impacting you here and now, so it's impacting your ability to enjoy your life or to function well, it's impacting your wellness and your health, then that's why we're going to want to dig, so to speak. And oftentimes it traces back. It traces back to roots. And then we can uncover there and, it's releasing, it's freeing, it's clarifying. Mm-hmm. And it just makes so much more sense. And now when I move forward, I can understand when these old patterns are coming up for me, that's some of the why. And I can actually choose to reorient, in a more intentional way. That's still some of what I'm going to do in coaching, but I'm not going to be as intentional about tracing back to the roots, or it's more like what we call psychodynamic in the therapy realm. I'm not going to necessarily go that route on purpose, but if we're headed that way, we're headed that way. And what I will say is if I'm noticing with a coaching client that there's a lot of trauma that needs to be processed at a deeper level, then I'm going to recommend that they see a therapist. I can't be someone's therapist and their coach. It's not ethical, and it breaches a lot of therapeutic boundaries. So what I would say is I would recommend for them to work with a therapist. It's up to them if they would want to continue working with me and the therapist. Mm-hmm. I would never force anyone to do anything, but I would not be able to provide deep processing therapy within the coaching realm. However, as a therapist, you can pull some coaching in. Mm-hmm. You can pull some coaching aspects into the room and be very action and goal oriented and, have assignments and tasks that are outside of the coaching, outside of the therapy office that someone can incorporate into their life. In fact, that's how you get faster results. Not that faster is always better. So I don't want to be misleading there. Right. But certainly when you take things outside of the either therapy office or the coaching session and you start applying it in your life, that's where you're going to get the momentum.
Okay. And could you speak just a little bit more about the ethics of each one? Because, you mentioned that, it's not ethical to be both somebody's coach and therapist. Mm-hmm. So could you speak to that?
Yes, that's a good question. Therapy, because of the level of, there's a lot of training that goes into becoming a therapist, extensive training, years of experience, clinical licensure. In order to uphold that licensure, you are overseen by a credentialing body and you are expected required, legally obligated to follow all of those expectations. So you may have heard of HIPAA. That's something, right, that we need to follow in therapy. We need to keep all of your information private and confidential. And so we can't blur boundaries. We can't have what we call a dual relationship. If someone is your therapist, they are legally only and ever able to be your therapist. Now, differing from state to state, there's sometimes years put on that, maybe like 5 years post-therapy, then that dual relationship can expire or whatever. That depends state to state, so I can't go into those specifics. But generally speaking, once a therapist, always your therapist. Can't have a different relationship outside of the therapy relationship, because there is that kind of expert status assigned to therapists that has this inherent sense of authority in a relationship, and that authority can be misused. And we really want to protect people from ever being in a position where they're feeling influenced by the authority of a therapist in a negative or unhealthy way. And so that's a lot of what the governing body wants to assure does not happen. And as a therapist, you're able to work with people in all different places of life, many of whom are in crisis mode sometimes. And so not always in a place where they can practice their autonomy the way I would expect a coach and client to be able to do. Mm-hmm. Right. And so that means that the liability is bigger, because the challenges that can be presented by clients, they're also bigger. And we need to make sure that we are being careful and diligent about how we are treating our clients so that they stay safe, their information stays private, and they're getting the care that they need. Mm-hmm. Does that answer your question? Because I might have gone off a little bit on that.
Yes, that absolutely helps. That really does. That helps. Yeah. And you also mentioned a few minutes ago, you said that coaching can help faster, but then you said faster is not always better. And yes. I've studied Peter Levine's work. I'm one class away from finishing because of COVID. So I've still got my advanced too. But it's huge to focus on titration, which is really slowing things down. So can you speak a little bit to, like why faster is not always better, and why you might want to slow it down a little bit when you're working with somebody?
Yes. So it's not necessarily that coaching can be faster, but it's when you're taking things outside of the session or outside of the room, whether it's therapy or coaching, that helps make it faster. And what makes the difference, whether it's therapy or coaching, is repetition, because that's how our brains learn. Whatever we're going to repeat on a consistent basis, our brains are going to want to do that more efficiently, and therefore they're going to make it easier for us to go to that behavior or that thought process. And so that takes time. You can't rush that. The only way that you can actually make that faster, and I'm doing air quotes for those that are listening to audio, is if you are repeating it more and more, if you are practicing it more and more. And so if you are, a lot of people view therapy as only happening in the session. So if you are only practicing new thought practices or talking about the things that are coming up for you that you're wanting to shift behaviors in. If you're only practicing that in session, say once a week, and you're not carrying that over to incorporating different practices throughout the week in your day-to-day life, then it's just going to take longer because you're retraining at a slower pace. Mm-hmm. With coaching, at least my tendency is to provide actionable steps, not just during the session, but in between sessions. So I can provide modules, which I do, pre-recorded modules that have pieces in there to walk through steps. I have in between spot coaching sessions, right? So I have all these other layers that I don't necessarily have the opportunity to provide in therapy that help hold the person accountable to practice in between sessions. Whereas in therapy, of course, we talk about assignments, if applicable, depending on the person, and supporting them with carrying that through. But the accountability piece is, with how I operate, is not as high between sessions with therapy as it is with coaching.
Okay.
Therefore, it can go faster because the practice is happening more regularly due to the heightened accountability.
Okay. And could you maybe give an example of what, or just maybe a few parameters around, and I know that, again, this is generalities, but maybe a few general parameters about why somebody might want to take the slower route versus, the faster route, because there are really important considerations on, do you really want to slow this down? Do you want to practice on your own in between, or do you need only to work with the therapist during session?
Yes. So if we're not in a place where we feel safe with our emotions, if we're not in a place where we feel safe physically, if we're not in a place where we are able to engage with our own thoughts, our own feelings without feeling unsafe, then we're not in a place yet to do that in between stuff on our own. And therefore, it makes sense to wait until your therapy session, so you have that person that you support, that supports you and that you trust, to be there with you and to support you in a way that feels safe. Mm-hmm. That means you got to take it slower, because you need to feel safe in order to make that progress. If you're not feeling safe, you can wind up heightening your symptoms. And so absolutely, if emotions flooding you is something that's challenging for you, or perhaps feeling disassociated, anything that's not feeling safe for you, it makes sense to not do things between sessions on your own, and to do it in session with your therapist, because if you're not feeling safe with yourself, therapy is the route to go. And if you're not feeling safe as far as like suicide or anything like that is concerned, crisis is where you would need to be, right? Because that's a higher level of care, which means you have people that are with you all of the time to make sure that you are physically safe. It's not, you're not in a place where you can practice that on your own, and therefore you don't want to rush that. You can't rush that, in fact, because it's going to take time for your mind and your body to learn what it feels to be safe again, to learn how to feel safe again, right? And as you said, that happens within the context of relationships.
Absolutely.
Right? And so you need that context in that relationship. You want that to gradually be nurtured in a safe way, because that is gaining that experience that you need to learn, I can feel safe in a relationship, right? We cannot rush that. It's not possible. We can't rush that. It's too important. You're too important if you're not feeling safe with yourself. Like, you are too important to try to rush that. There's no light switch, which if you were to ask anyone that works with me, I say all the time, there is no light switch for any of this stuff. There is not. Right. And so absolutely, there's a time and a place to want to move forward in an expedited route, and there's a time and a place to take that slow and gradual route. But never is there a light switch. Never is there a light switch.
Right.
And sometimes we want that. Sometimes we want that, right? Like, I just want it to go away. I just want it to stop. I just want it to be better. I just want it to be fixed. And that's not how it works. And if it did, if you just got everything all at once, it wouldn't mean as much to you anyway. And I know that's really hard to hear if you're in a really difficult place right now. I can say that from experience, because I've had my own challenges with mental health, with depression and bulimia and anxiety. And I know when you're in the midst of it, you don't want to hear like, this too shall pass, or you're not alone. Like, you don't want to hear that. And yet there's a part of you that can find a comfort if you're able to just plug into that little part of you that can find this comfort that, like, I'm strong. And if I'm feeling like I can't be strong right now, it's okay to lean on someone else. It's okay to reach out. It's okay to ask for help. And it's okay if it takes some time, because this support that I need right now, it's so meaningful and so powerful and so worth it. If I could just switch it off, I wouldn't need that support. I don't need the relationship. It's like trying to cut the relationships out of the picture.
Right.
We don't want that. we don't want, even if you feel like in the moment you do, in the long run, our life is made up of all these connections and beautiful experiences with ourselves and with one another. Yeah. And so we want to do what we can to nurture those and to make those have opportunities of joy and pleasure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so important. And I love how you describe that. I say the same thing, that you really have to get this. You have to do it slowly. I call it Pavloving ourselves. I turned Pavlov's name into a verb. I don't know if it's a real word, but I made it once.
I say therapizing all the time.
Yeah.
Totally not a word, but.
Yeah, but we do. It's kind of like we have to Pavlov ourselves. And he didn't, just get the food and the bell and the saliva. That didn't happen once. It wasn't the flip of a switch. That took time to get it there. And I know a lot of my listeners have heard me talk about, in past episodes, we've talked about the neuroplasticity of the brain. And that's what you're talking about. If you want that neuroplasticity and those new neural connections to stick, you have to choose them and practice them. So it becomes part of your procedural memory. And I think it's, and I don't know that a lot of therapists go into explanations. I've never had a therapist ever talk to me about the difference between explicit and procedural memory. I learned that when I started taking classes, to become trauma informed. And, years ago, and I'm like, wow, why didn't anybody ever tell me this? It would have been, it was life-changing when it became part of my conscious awareness, the difference between the implicit mind and the explicit mind and procedural memory and explicit memory and how all that works.
So you just said something I think is really important, because you were at a place to hear it. And maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago, you weren't. So even if someone had told you, it may not have had that same level of impact. Maybe it would have been nice, maybe it would have been helpful, but it may not have had that same level of impact as it did for you in those moments. And I think that speaks to the question you asked too of when is it good to go fast and when is it good to slow down, is you're in different places throughout your life. And so when you're going to receive the experience or the information, that it's going to hit you differently at different points in time. And that's another reason why it can't be rushed. Because so I do psychoeducation for both, coaching and therapy clients based on brain science and all of those pieces. But I'm careful not to give too much all at once, because if they're not ready to hear it, or if they're not ready to hear all of it, it's going to overwhelm them. And if they're feeling more overwhelmed, they're going to pull back. Right? And that's going to make it more difficult for us to move forward. So I'm very careful about when and how much information I'm giving at any given time to any particular person.
I am guilty. My name's Jennifer, and I'm an oversharer. That should be my support group. I overshare information. I do everything you just said not to do. So guilty of that.
Information is great. I mean, there's a lot of it. And so I think that can speak to some of that imposter syndrome of we all want more information, and sometimes we find comfort in the more information, but sometimes we rely too much on it. And so being in the moment and in the experience, it can be enough sometimes. That doesn't mean that information isn't awesome. It's great to have information, but we're not always going to be ready for all of it. And therefore we're not going to process all of it all the time either.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So Toni, what are some parameters in a person's life, or, some signs in a person's life that they might be ready for coaching, which is a little bit faster? Or a different approach, where they have more homework in between sessions or more accountability in between?
I would say that the highly motivated would be a great candidate for my coaching. Okay. If they're, and highly motivated, meaning I want to do the work. I'm wanting and ready for this shift. I am welcoming it in, even though it might feel scary. And of course it will, because all new things feel scary to some extent. But I'm ready. I'm ready and I'm wanting, right? So that has that kind of,
the hell yes excitement versus the I want to try it.
Yes. And I'm careful to even say that, because if you want to try it, and the hesitancy is that fear, that's also normal. So get on the phone, and it not necessarily doesn't have to be me. I mean, if you feel connection with me, of course, but if you feel connection with a different coach, reach out and say, I'm wanting to, but I'm feeling scared, and this is why. And that's a great way to begin and get an idea of, will this coach be able to support me with my fears? By the end of that call, you will most likely have a little bit more clarity of, okay, maybe I'm still feeling a little bit fearful, but I feel a connection with this coach. I believe we're on the same page, and I want this. I want this particular goal, right? This more balance in my life. Like, I want this. It matters to me. Mm-hmm. And I support, like, we always are boosting motivation in the beginning of my coaching program. So we're wanting to build that up and increase that momentum in the beginning of the coaching, so that we can maintain that momentum and be able to plug into it when we need to throughout the duration of our coaching time together. But for therapy, you don't have to be as highly motivated. Not that you don't do therapy, because you are. You could be highly motivated and still do therapy. I have plenty of clients that are highly motivated and still do therapy, but they know that they were wanting to process some things. They experience some challenges and trauma in their background, and they're wanting to process it. And some people just prefer therapy because they know it better. They're not familiar with coaching, and it's not comfortable for them, so they just don't want to go there. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, I think there's still a lot of misconceptions about coaching, and I admit that I've had them myself. My first few experiences, one in particular with a coach, was very protocol driven. So, the first time you come in, this is what we're going to do. The next time, this is what we're going to do. And so that was my introduction to coaching. And I'm like, but I don't need steps 1, 2, and 3. I'm ready to jump in with step 4. And that didn't matter. So I felt like there was an agenda being pushed on me. And I ended up, after I learned about the coaching program, I ended up not going with it because it felt like an imposition and not what I was looking for. So I think those are important considerations, because I can see where that really structured coaching could work for some people and not for others. So I think it's really important. And at the same time, I've looked back at my own misconceptions about coaching. And that's one of the reasons I chose to call myself a strategist and not a coach, because I didn't want that stigma following me around. And it's not about the label, it's about the person. But anyway, strategist is what I am.
It's whatever fits for you, right? Yeah. I can plead guilty there. I definitely had, some aversions to coaching initially that I, worked through myself, and that came from my therapy background and, some of the misconceptions that are presented. And, I put the onus on myself that I needed to do the research in order to shift my perspective and be open to learning new things about coaching. And I will say, I'm really glad I did. Mm-hmm. I am. I'm really glad I did. I've met some really amazing people in the process that I wouldn't have otherwise met, I don't think, if I hadn't allowed myself to welcome coaching into my life as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you have a coach?
Right now, I do not. Nope. I have a therapist right now. I don't have a coach. I have invested in coaches, and they've been awesome and all very different. Some more protocol driven, as you said, some less so. And I've learned from my experience in each of those kind of investments that I made with, I guess, 3 different coaches at this point, all incredibly different. And I learned what feels good to me and what doesn't, which has helped me be a better coach and me create different, programs. So I do have different options to help meet people where they're at. But there is still, I do have expectations, and I want my clients to have expectations too, because I want to hold my clients accountable for their process so they can get the outcome that they desire. But I expect myself, to be held accountable on my end, so that I'm following through with what I need to follow through, and I'm not missing pieces of the puzzle, and I'm not just kind of allowing myself to go off on a tangent and not serving them right back at the goal. So if I don't have some kind of strategy or outline that I'm following, it feels chaotic, and that's not who I am. So, and that's not how I want to operate. So I do have a strategy on brain science that I follow that research, neuroscience. I also incorporate different pieces of spirituality, and just a variety of psychology and things like that. All different pieces of my personal and professional background I bring to the table in my coaching business, as well as some in my therapy business, depending. There are some clients that are more spiritually led and spiritually based that I'll bring some spiritual pieces in, but I very much so am more cautious about that in the therapy realm. There's not much disclosure is different in therapy than it is in coaching. Coaching, there tends to be a lot more self-disclosure, whereas in therapy, you need to be diligent, careful, and some people actually don't disclose at all. There's no self-disclosure in therapy at all. So there's definitely more strict and stringent boundaries in the therapy realm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's and the self-disclosure piece can be really tricky, because without there being any self-disclosure at all, it can feel like there's no connection with the person you're talking to. It can just feel really cold, like the therapist is like, and what do you think about that? Or how do you feel about that? And on the other end of the spectrum, if there's too much disclosure, it can almost be this weird transference where you have like this needy coach who's, almost needing to overshare. And so it's really important to find that balance, because not everybody's perfect. Therapists and coaches, strategists, we're all human too. And we're all going through our own process. Nobody's perfect. And so, I think that relational aspect is so, so important.
I agree.
One other thing in the coaching world is there are so many different labels in the coaching world. There's life coaching, there's business coaching, there's wellness coaching. And, my title is empowerment strategist. And, it's like, how can a person look at all of the different types of coaching that are out there and maybe sift through it and discern? Because, it can almost be like, going to a nursery for the first time and you don't know anything about plants, and there are just all these plants around you. Like, I have no idea which one work.
Yeah. Right. I don't think there's an easy answer to that as far as looking at the labels and discerning from there, because really you can choose your label in coaching. Anyone can create any label and choose whatever label works for them. So I would encourage, again, that consultation and to read about the person, like I have an About Me section on my website. Read about the person and see if there's a connection. Again, bringing yourself back to that connection. I don't think the term matters. I don't. I think the connection matters so much more, especially with coaching. I mean, in therapy, there's limited licensures, but to be honest, if you're not a therapist, you often don't know most people don't know what my LCSW stands for unless they are familiar with the lingo of clinical realm, right? So they go based off of what we talked about, like the insurance piece or the specialty or the vibe that they get when they talk with me, right? And so I would say focus on the connection and what feels good to you. When you look into this person's eyes, do you feel supported? Do you feel comforted? Do you feel judged? What do you feel? Because that matters. And people forget that how they feel matters. I'm not saying give your feelings the driver's seat and let them take over. That's not what I'm suggesting. But I am suggesting that you acknowledge how you feel, you recognize it, and you allow it to be a part of your decision-making process.
Yeah, that's super important. I've talked a lot about that in past episodes, about how our feelings are really especially sensation and emotion in the body, are really our GPS system. If we know what those signals mean whenever they come up. And that's an important aspect too. Yeah. Gosh, I can't believe we're this far into it already. Wow.
I'm glad.
Yeah, we're I don't know, we've got like a little over 10 minutes until we're an hour in. Go figure. So Toni, one thing I recommend to my clients, based upon everything you were just saying, like reading websites and all of that, I recommend as you're shopping around and you go to somebody's website, so many of us have like little video clips. Watch those video clips, get a feel for the person, get a feel for their baseline, how they talk, how they speak, how they move. If you can't sit through a 2 or 3 minute video on somebody's website because you're annoyed or it's just too much, do you really want to go into a coaching program where you're going to be, sitting in an office or possibly in the COVID era on Zoom calls? And do you work online on, this type of conference with clients?
I do. Everything's online right now. Generally speaking, my coaching sessions are virtual anyway, but at this time, everything, including my private practice, is virtual at this time, providing telehealth. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yep. Okay. And are there any considerations that somebody would want to think of or would want to really, really think about before signing up with a therapist or a coach in an online session versus an in-person session? Does that matter one way or another?
So let me give a little caveat that I did personally have a bit of resistance switching from in-person therapy sessions to online therapy sessions. However, once the transition was made, I want to say after the first 5 weeks, we all have just gotten used to it. Myself, all my clients, we've just gotten used to it, to where now I think it's going to feel like a pretty big transition to go back to in person. And we're not doing that at this time, but I say that because I think that there's a bias of what you're used to. And sometimes you just want to do what's comfortable because it's what you're used to. That doesn't necessarily mean that another way can't serve you. And I cannot say that my clients have been less served because we're online. I can't say that. I don't think it's true. They continue to make great progress. And we continue to have powerful sessions. So, if you have a very strong preference, hey, go for that preference. Right now, at the time of our recording, COVID is still happening, and a lot of therapists, especially private practice, are opting to do telehealth to preserve the health of the masses, so to speak, because in an office, people are in and out, and there's often waiting rooms, and then there's a shared bathroom space. There's just a lot of sharing that's going around, people of all different ages, and so to err on the side of caution, that's just what a lot of therapists are doing. But generally speaking, outside of COVID times, I would say the typical has been in person. And I would have said that would have been my preference at that time. So that's a hard one to answer. I think if you just really have a strong preference, respect that and talk about that on the consultation call. I can't speak. I've had people reach out to me and say, I just want to schedule a session. And I always say, we need to have a consultation call first, because I want to assess for goodness of fit and see if I think I'm a good fit for you, just as much as I want you to assess for goodness of fit to see if I'm a good fit for you. And that consultation call gives us the chance to do that without high pressure, So I really do recommend it. If you're open to doing that, I really do recommend it, especially if they're offering that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of us have been surprised at how successful we can translate things online, whereas before we thought, oh, this would never work online. So COVID has actually shown us that some of our assumptions were just that. They were assumptions. Yeah. Yep. And another question, a couple weeks ago when you and I chatted, you mentioned that you can be more creative with your coaching. So do you mind giving us a few examples of what does that creativity look like in your coaching that you wouldn't see in your therapy?
Mm-hmm. So I kind of spoke just a little bit to that earlier, in that I am able to provide different kinds of support between sessions. So I can do a spot coaching session where we can, if they're really having a hard time, they can email me and I'll respond. Or if it's something I think we need to get on the phone for 15 minutes, we can schedule a 15-minute phone call. I also provide recordings that they can access whenever, wherever they need to, that supports them. And when there's a recurrent theme that I see a need coming up, or even for a particular person, I can create a video and offer that to them for them to be able to utilize at any point too. Mm-hmm. So there's such a variety of things that I can introduce to not just during our sessions, but between our sessions that allow me to be of further support. And I'm not able to do that as much in therapy. So we can't communicate via email in order to comply with HIPAA and to ensure, that every possible shred of any kind of privacy or personal information could not possibly get out to anyone. I do not communicate any personal information with therapy clients via email. Mm-hmm. And so it's just, scheduling or canceling or something like that. Or maybe, sending a document that doesn't have personal information or whatever the case is via email. But that in-between support is not the same. And because my coaching it often comes in packages, there are some exceptions where that's different, but typically my coaching is in a package, which means you're not you're not paying piecemeal. You're getting this package of wraparound support. It's like having me in your pocket. Whereas in therapy, you're paying typically, again, this is for me, I'm sure there's some other therapists out there that might do it a little bit differently, but per hour or per whatever the session is. And so the in-between time, we'd have to book another session or something if you need support in between there, or I'd refer you to a crisis unit if you're in crisis and things like that. So the dynamics are different. The legality is different, and therefore my ability to offer a variety of support during and between sessions is just different. It's different, not bad. It's not in a bad way. It's different. And I think it's different for good reason. I don't think this is a bad thing. And I'm glad that you're highlighting some of these pieces so that people can hear. This isn't about good or bad or right or wrong. This is really about feeling out what feels good for you. What feels good for you is going to be different than what feels good for the next person. And that's okay. That's okay.
Yeah. And I do want to point out that that's another thing that I hear a lot about coaches is coaches have packages. And I don't think I've ever come across a therapist that has packages. And that's just my personal experience. So a lot of times when you sign up for coaching, you're working with somebody for a month or 3 months or 6 months at a time. And like going into it that, okay, I've got 3 months, before I decide, do I want to do this again or what my progress is? Where in therapy, there's not necessarily that beginning and end parameter. Because you just don't know. But in either situation, you just don't know how you're going to progress. And I also think there's a different state of mind going into the two different.
I agree.
The two different ones. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, Toni, this information is just fantastic. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your brilliance with us. This is wonderful. And I imagine that some of the listeners out there are going to want to look you up. They're going to want to find you online. So, for the listeners, this will be in the show notes. So if you're reading or watching, all you have to do is, scroll down to the bottom of the page and all the links will be there. But for our listeners, how can they find you online?
So I would say simply reach out to me, email me. I like to hear from people. I like to be able to respond. I do personally respond to all my emails, and that email is hello, HELLO, at Dr. Dr. Toni, Toni, coaches, COACHES.com. And as you said, we'll have the link to my actual website in the show notes. And you can click there too and schedule a free consult with me there too if you have questions or anything like that. But on that site, there is an area that says therapy or coaching. So if you're wanting to read a little bit more or dig in a little bit more, you can check that out too. And you can see if there is any more information that you'd like to have answered there about the difference between therapy or coaching and which one might be good for you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Toni, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show with us today. It really has been an honor. And this information, I think, is going to be invaluable to people. I really do. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And I certainly do hope that this information is helpful. And as I said, please feel free to reach out, ask me any questions. If I can answer them, I will. And if I can't, I will do my best to point you in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And Toni, before we finally sign off, do you have any final tips or bits of wisdom to leave with our listeners today?
I said earlier on that I reserve my right to grow. And that has been a really powerful motto that I've created and coined for myself to lean into. And I think it's especially important right now, given all the divisive times that are happening for everyone and the pressure that we put on ourselves or we put on other people to just know everything or do everything right, or being feared of being judged. And that's amping up our anxiety, our stress levels. It's amping all these pieces that would lead someone to do therapy or coaching. And so what I want to say to you is reserve your right to grow. You don't need to be perfect. You don't need to know everything. You don't need to do everything on your own. Reserve your right to grow. That right now you know enough. And in the next moment, you'll learn something else. And then you'll know enough. And then you'll learn something else. And you'll continuously grow and evolve. And let that be okay. It's very freeing.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Toni. It's been an honor to have you on the show. And for all of our listeners, if you have questions, Toni's email was hello@drtonycoaches.com. You can always reach out to me at info@jenniferwhitacre.com. And I have the same response Toni has. If I can't answer your question, I will do what I can to point you in the right direction or help you find an answer. And if you found value out of this episode, which I can't imagine that you didn't, there's just so much good stuff in this episode on just how to make a decision on what's right for me. Or if you know somebody who's struggling and doesn't know which route to take, please share this episode. Please subscribe. I know that there are a lot of people out there who could be helped by this, and this is important information. So please spread the word, and I hope to see you all again next week on Yes And.
We have just concluded another episode of the Yes And podcast with Jennifer Whitacre. For additional resources, please visit our website, jenniferwhitacre.com. Leave a review if you enjoyed the show and find it useful. Until next time, continue challenging conventional thinking and keep moving forward.